Welcome to our introduction to William Shakespeare. One could plausibly consider this man to be the greatest writer to have ever existed. He was born in 1564 and died in 1616. He was the son of a glover, that is a glove maker, and his mother was a Catholic, so that's an interesting detail in a country that had become reformed, quote unquote, under Queen Elizabeth in a definitive way. Many people want to assign the great corpus of Shakespeare's writing to other men, including Francis Bacon, whom we treated last time, Christopher Marlowe, another great playwright, and the Earl of Oxford are some of the leading contenders. But this, I think, has to do with the snobbery that this man came from one of the lower classes, a commoner, and yet was able to write plays that have in a profound way affected how we experience our own lives. That is, Harold Bloom, the great literary critic, talks about Shakespeare as the inventor of the human, which might be a little overstating things, but he certainly has given the sense of interiority that we experience as Western romantic subjects. And there is no other figure who has done more to shape that sensibility. And so I ask this question, can experiencing a literary drama expand our sensibility? So Shakespeare is still popularly produced. This is the playwright that pays the bills, even if a dramatic theater company wants to put on more contemporary plays. Shakespeare's the one that pays the bills, the way Nutcracker pays the ballet bills. And it's because Shakespeare, even though the language has shifted since his day, we are still grabbed by the power of the rhetoric, but more importantly, by the range of experience that he presents to us. We have never seen before this man, and probably never since, such a range of voices from all the classes. We've talked in last semester about how Chaucer introduces people from other classes, and that's kind of a new thing. But with Shakespeare, you're inhabiting these lives. You feel with them the joys and the griefs of both commoner and king. And this is essential for our sense of the range of possibility of human experience. Shakespeare's part of what in literary circles is still considered the Renaissance, so that depends on which field you're in, how you periodize the Renaissance. Cervantes is around the same time, a contemporary, and they're both considered Renaissance writers, whereas, of course, in the political sphere, you've got the Renaissance and the artistic sphere that really happening in the 15th century. Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway, not the one we know, in 1582 when he was 18. Anne was, I think, 8 years older. They had their first child, Susanna, 6 months after their wedding. And then about 2 years later, Anne had twins, Judith and Hamlet. So there are lots of reasons to think the conspiracy theories about Shakespeare not writing Shakespeare's plays. But the fact that the loss of Hamlet obviously bears on the play Hamlet, I think settles the issue. But one can have fun with the conspiracies if you want. He was an actor, other than being the playwright that he was, an actor, a director, a stage manager, a part owner of the companies that he was part of, which at first were the Lord Chamberlain's men, that for the patron that really kept that company going. And then after the accession of King James I, King James took on that patronage and they became the King's Men. His period of most active playwright production was between 1589 or thereabouts to 1613, so about 12 years before 1600 and about 12 years after. 1600 being a very important time in his productivity because that's when Hamlet comes out, and that's obviously kind of a supreme play in the Western canon. He also wrote 154 sonnets, a couple of long poems, and he was an incredibly prolific man. It is hard to grasp. One can see why. Well, how could one human being encompass so many worlds? But he did, and that's part of the wonder here. The plays run from at least 2,000 lines. I believe the Tempest, which is the one we're going to treat, is the shortest. Can run all the way close to 4,000, as with Hamlet. You've got characters maybe as few as 15, but compare that to when Sophocles adds a third actor, right? It's very different from classical stage, where you've got just a few actors on stage. You can go from 15 to 50. Classical unities of drama, you concentrated on one action unfolding. Of course, Shakespeare has double plots and multiple plots, especially often a commoner line that is humorous. After Hamlet, you've got the problem plays, Troilus and Cressida, All's Well That Ends Well, Measure for Measure. So he starts out writing the Henry VI plays, actually, some formulaic comedies and tragedies like Titus Andronicus, which is bloody. But he gets more sophisticated as he goes along. Gets to Hamlet, then you've got the problem plays, which are there's reconciliation, but they're very dark in places. Actually, with Troilus, it doesn't get much lighter. And that leads into the great tragedies that he composes between 1604 and 1606. Othello, King Lear, Macbeth. He ends his solo productivity. There's a couple of plays after 1612 that he writes, but the last 4 plays he writes are what we now call romances. Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and then finally The Tempest, which is the last of his solo authored plays. It's a valedictory play. It is suffused with a sense of melancholy of a man who is thinking about what his art has meant in the world and trying to settle accounts. And it's a very beautiful play to deal with, other than the fact that it's shorter, so more easily treated in our context. These romances have many folkloric elements and fanciful elements. They're definitely, they partake of a kind of magic realism. There's often a pattern here, certainly in the Tempest, of a great injustice that's been done. You see this in other plays too. There's purgative suffering, and then there's the reconciliation. And that of course is the deepest theme in Shakespeare's reconciliation, forgiveness. And that's it's something we need to hear more and more in our time, obviously. The Globe Theatre was built in 1599 on the south bank of the Thames. Shakespeare is playing off of a literary Renaissance trope. You see this in the playwright Calderon, of the great theater of the world, and that's something that was literally represented in the Globe. The ceiling was painted with stars. There'd be the trapdoor in the middle of the stage, which was called Hell. So you have this macrocosm being represented in the theater and in the plays, and this is something to keep in mind reading Shakespeare, that he's very often doing that meta thing, that he's making us think about our role, think about what the playwright is doing in marshaling these lives on stage, and how we can insert ourselves into the drama, how we can think of our own lives in terms of a drama, maybe a theodrama, where perhaps, if one's religious, can think of it as being an arrangement where there's a greater intentionality than our own. He depended for his plots often on plots that had already been written up. Raphael Holinshed's The Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland was very important, especially for the history plays. Plutarch's Parallel Lives, a translation was recently made by Lord North, and he draws material, for instance, for Coriolanus from that. And Boccaccio's Decameron was translated recently, and that he draws material from, and so on. The point wasn't originality in plot making. The point was to dispose the plot elements in new ways with great resonances, and of course with that inimitable language of his. To get a sense of that language, it's very important to try to read the plays aloud if one can, to hear the music. Some of the words will seem, of course, foreign, and that's why the editions that are available have all of these footnotes trying to explain what the words mean. But I would urge that one, especially with the first encounter, don't get bogged down with the notes, to just read it, to hear the music, or perhaps, in fact, go to a Shakespeare performance, take up one of the BBC productions. It's important to both have the play enacted, to experience it that way, but also to read the play, because first, they often get cut, almost always get cut in productions now, but the language is so sumptuous, one wants to bathe in it. Generally, Shakespeare writes the plays in what's called blank verse, that is unrhymed iambic pentameter, which is ba-bump, 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 ba-bump. And so we'll take a look at this at the end of this introduction, but Caliban says this: "Be not afeared, the isle is full of noises," and there's an extra unstressed syllable there. So there's 5 feet of bump, be not afeared. You can scan this when you're writing in verse that has a regular rhythm. It's very useful as a poet to know that you can fit it this way, even though it's artificial. Sounds and sweet airs. You wouldn't actually read it that way, but when you write according to a set pattern, and I find this as a working poet, it really does help to give order to one's, that's what music is, right? It's order on the noise. So you can construct it this way, it's there, sounds and sweet airs, in fact, but then of course when you read it, you're going to do sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. It's important when you don't have an in-stop line. An in-stop line is one that has a punctuation mark. You pause there. But if there isn't a punctuation mark and it's in-jammed, one should not stop at that line. One should go on and read it. You don't stop at every line of verse. So that's important too. Okay, so we'll close with a few passages. The first one is going to be from in the Tempest. You have 2 characters that are above the human and one's below the human, kind of. Shakespeare's dealing with the fact that he's inheriting this great chain of being notion where there are creatures both above and below the human. He asks Ariel, his sprite, his air spirit who does his bidding, how his charm is working. So the basic plot is Prospero, the great magus of the island in the Tempest, has been usurped by his brother. This happens a lot in Shakespeare's plays, actually, this tension between brothers. And he was the Duke of Milan, but he's been thrust out. In fact, he was set to die. He was cast out to die with his little daughter, Miranda. He has used Ariel to cause a tempest to bring to wreck on the island the instruments of his usurpation, and to try to unwind that. Okay, so he's the stage manager of this, and the director and the playwright inside this play. He's getting the courtly shipwrecked people to march in a body along the island in one group. The lower class people he's marching in another group, and then the son of the King of Naples, Ferdinand, whom he's trying to set up with his daughter Miranda. He has in his power and is working him to become worthy of his daughter. He asks Ariel, how is his plan working with regard to the people who are responsible for their being marooned on this island? Ariel says, your charm so strongly works them that if you now beheld them, your affections would become tender. Prospero says, dost thou think so, spirit? Mine would, sir, were I human. Okay, so there's this thing about what Harold Bloom is talking about. What does it mean to be human? Prospero responds, would my affections become tender? He says, and mine shall. Hast thou, which art but air, a touch, a feeling of their afflictions, and shall not myself, one of their kind, that relish all as sharply passion as they, be kindlier moved than thou art? Though with their high wrongs I am struck to the quick, yet with my nobler reason 'gainst my fury do I take part. The rarer action is in virtue than in vengeance. They, being penitent, the sole drift of my purpose doth extend not a frown further. Go release them, Ariel. My charms I'll break, their senses I'll restore, and they shall be themselves. Beautiful, beautiful poetry. On the flip side, and this is where, and we'll end with this sequence, Shakespeare's living, of course, in the wake of the voyages of discovery, and the New World exercised a profound influence on the imagination. We talked about this a bit with Bacon. Of course, there was great, horrendous suffering in the wake of the European colonization of the New World. And these issues about what it means to be human are brought up. Caliban is their servant on this island. He's kind of, he has speech, so maybe he's human, but he seems to be less than human. So there's this master-slave dialectic. Prospero says we need this guy to do our labor, and Miranda says, "Well, I don't like him, and there's a reason why." Caliban says, "As wicked dew as ere my mother brushed with raven's feather from unwholesome fin drop on you both," Prospero and Miranda. "A southwest blow on you and blister you all o'er," Prospero. "For this be sure tonight thou shalt have cramps, side stitches that shall pin thy breath up. Urchins shall forth at vast of night, that they may work all exercise on thee. Thou shalt be pinched as thick as honeycomb, each pinch more stinging than bees that made him." Caliban. "I must eat my dinner. This island's mine, by Sycorax, my mother, which thou takest from me. When thou camest first, thou strokest me and made much of me, wouldst give me water with berries in it, and teach me how to name the bigger light and how the less that burn by day and night. And then I loved thee, and showed thee all the qualities of the isle, the fresh springs, brine pits, barren place, and fertile. Cursed be the eye that did so. All the charms of Sycorax, toads, beetles, bats, light on you, for I am all the subjects that you have, which first was mine own king. And here do you sty me in this hard rock, whilst you do keep from me the rest of the island." So it sounds like this is a revolutionary who's saying, you have usurped me, you who have been usurped. And I think Shakespeare's trying to put that out to us to consider. But then there's more of the story. "Thou most lying slave," Prospero says, "whom stripes may move, not kindness, I have used thee, filth as thou art, with humane care, and lodged thee in mine own cell, till thou didst seek to violate the honor of my child." Here we can get into intersectionality, right? So there's another victim, right? The female who is powerless before the threat of this unbridled lust. The problem, of course, is that also fits into a kind of stereotype. And so I think Shakespeare is raising these issues, or else we can raise them in Shakespeare. Caliban says, "Oh ho, what had been done had I raped her? Thou didst prevent me. I'd peopled else this isle with Calibans." Okay. Why I think Shakespeare is complicating this is that he has Caliban say some of the most beautiful lines. We started here, but I'll read the whole passage to end this introduction. I think Shakespeare wants us to feel the humanity of Caliban. Reconciliation somehow, and maybe Shakespeare the playwright wasn't quite able to get there, but I don't know. There's so much of the capaciousness of charity in Shakespeare. Caliban says to his lower class compatriots, this is the comic subplot, they're very worried about the music that Ariel is putting in the air. Caliban says, "Be not afeard. The isle is full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about mine ears, and sometimes voices that, if I then had waked after long sleep, will make me sleep again. And then in dreaming, the clouds methought would open and show riches ready to drop upon me, that when I waked, I cried to dream again." Well, to feel our way into someone who is supposedly a villain, that's the kind of miracle that Shakespeare can work for us, to try to become as great and capacious as the world, to try to reconcile all things, which Shakespeare, the playwright, has done in his corpus in each of these plays. And it's something that we need to do more and more to become more and more human.